Hi guys. I want to thank you all for the questions you turned in. I found it to be, I was quite happy with the questions you turned in. I thought they were very insightful, and they brought up lots of good things for us to talk about. So what I did, I took your questions, and it's about, well, I guess it's, you guys are probably all asleep the night before class, so I'm assuming if they're not in there by now, they probably won't be. But I took the questions that were in there, and I put them all together, and I tried to kind of draw out some themes. So here we go. Many of you asked questions. In fact, there were 5 of you who asked questions about kind of the origin of the scientific revolution and how it related to things that had come before it. Some of those were specifically about medieval ages or the Middle Ages. Some were more about the Renaissance. So let's just go through a few things. I think that we need to keep in mind that during the Middle Ages, because they had this major economic problem to solve, which was the problem of there's not enough food, or we've got to work really, really hard to create enough food so that we all have, things to eat and we can survive. That's kind of the dominant thing we need to bring out. That when that problem started to go away, so that's part of the reason that you guys studied the economic revolution last semester, or whenever you took history last at AISJ. When that economic problem of production, of producing enough food, enough that everyone could survive easily, kind of began to go away, it started to free people up to do other things. Now, I don't want to suggest that that there were all these smart scientists sitting around and, digging away at ditches and trying to get, corn to grow or something like that. And the moment that the economy got better, they all rushed off to their laboratories. No, it's a more, it's a more slow process than that. The situation began to occur where more and more people had more and more free time. They had more and more disposable income, so they wanted to spend the money on something. That ability to spend money on something made other people think, well, I'd like to produce something that people would want to buy. Well, that's going to lead people to begin looking to scientific discovery. How do I make something better? How do I do this in a better way that, in its nature is very much scientific? So really with the Renaissance, a lot of what we talk about is this shift, and it's very, very slow, it's nothing that's going to happen very quickly, and I'm going to talk more about that in 1 second. But it's about this shift towards people being, having more curiosity, and I don't even like to say it that way, but being able to act on their curiosity better. And obviously the more you do that, the more questions you have. None of you have questions about economics right now because you're not in my economics class. But once you get into an economics class, you start to have questions about that. So that's kind of part of it too. I think there's a problem, and it's something I think I talked about before, but it's good that we're getting to it again. You have to remember all these things that we talk about in history, whether it be the scientific revolution, the Renaissance, the age of exploration, where people were, Columbus and Da Gama and all that. All of these things are very much interrelated. It's not as if they're happening independently of each other. And oftentimes in history, we do kind of tend to we like to put things into nice, neat little packages so that we can study them in a specific way. And one of your questions, and you'll see this again, one of your questions was about, well, what is an interpretive claim? Well, remember, if I were to start speaking in Mongolian, I suppose nobody there speaks that. I don't either. But anyway, you would need an interpreter to tell you what I'm saying means. So, again, an interpretive claim is a historian or somebody else saying, well, these things happen, Copernicus was around, Galileo, Kepler, etc., but here's what it means. So, we tend to do that a lot in history. So, to say the Middle Ages and say they were like this brick of time that started here on a finite date and ended here on a finite date, and then the Renaissance was there, and then after that the scientific revolution. No, the colors blend together, bleed together much more than that. So yeah, essentially that's what I'm looking at there. Okay, next thing a lot of you asked about was the spread of the scientific revolution. And I think, even to kind of dovetail off of what we just said, many countries in the world today are still experiencing a scientific revolution. Some to greater extent than others, but even the most advanced places are having some sort of scientific revolution. They're learning more, they're applying things better. The technological revolution of the last 20 years has been very major in the way that the world works. So, anyhow, 3 of you asked about the spread of it, like basically where did it go, how did it spread, that sort of thing. So no, it was not the only one. Again, we don't want to put things, as historians, we like to put things into little neat packages, but we have to understand that's not really the way it happened. So it's not as if, even if you look at the time period we're studying from Copernicus, who I think he dies in like 1520, to Newton, who I think he dies around 1690, you're talking about 170 years. So that's a very long time. And, obviously it's going to be bits along the way as you go. So, was it the only one? No. Not in Europe, certainly not in other parts of the world. This kind of makes me think about, too, we have to remember that the reason that we call this the scientific revolution is because it came as part of this this age of discovery, as we call it, where Europeans were going out and exploring the globe, and much of today's culture is still rooted in that. But we have to remember, much of that discovery, we're going to talk about the printing press here in a second, the Chinese had the printing press for a long time before the Europeans got it. So how come we always associate it with the Europeans? Well, it's because the Europeans, again, they went out and kind of conquered or explored, or however you want to put it. Their culture became very pervasive throughout the world and has still stuck. Does that make it more important or more valid or anything like that? No, but it is what we're studying, so that's why we tend to focus on it more. So this, was it the only one? No, there have been scientific revolutions before, but this scientific revolution was in the right place at the right time, because it's kind of when the world was getting smaller and people were, growing closer together, via globalization and exploration. Okay, 3 of you asked, I was quite surprised by this, because it was very specific questions about the printing press, and you had some very interesting questions about it. One person asked, well, isn't this actually part of the Industrial Revolution, the printing press? Well, I'll go back to what I've already said. Remember that all these things kind of bleed together. So, sure, yes, of course it is. I guess from a historian's point of view, we tend to put the Industrial Revolution later in history. We put it kind of the mid-1800s, and this was all happening before that. Also, I guess I would point to that the printing press, even though we can think of a book, I've got a book here. Anyway, we can think of a book as, a good, a service, something that is produced, but it's not really the book that you're buying, is it? You're not buying the book because of the pretty pages or to look at the, you're not going to use the paper for something else. What's important about the book are the ideas inside of it. So that's another reason it's not really part of the Industrial Revolution, because many of those books that were being sold, or books that were popular at the time, were about the ideas. They were about the knowledge and the spread of ideas. So it does fit better there. But certainly that's a valid question, and I have no argument with that. Like, yeah, sure, it was definitely part of that movement towards industry. Okay, next somebody asked, how did they share ideas before? Well, that was really a large part of the problem, is they were not very able to share ideas before. If you had one scientist living in one part of Europe and a different scientist living in a different part, it was very unlikely that they were able to communicate with each other and figure out they were, working on the same thing, and maybe they could divide the work or, share their findings with each other. So that's, again, it's part of what we're trying to get to, is that this scientific revolution had the benefit of being able to spread more quickly because the printing press was there. Is it its own revolution, the printing press? I think that certainly would be a fine argument to make. You definitely could look at it that way. So again, here I have, well, both of these, to say, isn't it the industrial, isn't it its own revolution? Those are examples of what could be an interpretive claim. And certainly you could interpret it and find all sorts of evidence to make that the case for each of those questions. Several of you asked specifically about, well, why is Newton such a big deal? What did he do? He's not the guy who used the telescope. He's not the guy who discovered Jupiter's moons. Both of those were Galileo. He's not the guy who figured out the orbits were elliptical, etc., etc. Well, I think what's important to understand about Newton is, and I don't want to talk about this too much because it is actually a place that we're going. We'll study Newton and why he's so significant very in depth in a bit. But since you asked, one thing was that he was able to use math very well to predict where, a celestial body might be. He was able to use it to say, well, here's a mathematical model of the universe, not like a model you put together, but a model that predicts how planets move and where they move and why they move. So he did that very well. Again, he was also, if the order had been reversed, maybe it would be Galileo we talked about. But Galileo came a long time before Newton, so somebody had to do the early work, and, well, Newton's the one who was the beneficiary of all the early work that had already been done. Again, the printing press. His ideas were recorded. He was able to put them down, and people were able to read about them. He wrote in a manner that was easily understood, not just by, I don't mean by your common person on the street, maybe not. I don't know that I could read Newton right now and really make a whole lot of sense of it. But, other scientists, other people who understood those things, they certainly could. So, yeah, we'll talk a lot more about Newton in the future, but essentially he is so well thought of because, well, he's the guy who really made it stick. The other guys, they made important steps along the way, but he's the guy who really, finalized it all. Okay,